the US Air Force were studying pilots in World War II, and they took all the average measurements and they put together an average cockpit, and a bunch of pilots had to bail and some died, right? One of the people working there went and said, okay, let's find how many people are average. Zero people fit those measurements, right? And what they found was that they needed to create a few different abilities, putting the seat farther back or forward, up or down, some of those things. And when they did that, the problem went away overnight. I think it's the same thing for work, and it's whether it's work from home or work from the office. It should just flex to the different needs of different people because we are different and we need to kind of enhance what is good in our brains and help out the crutches that we need and get those all together until we're operating efficiently.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Bad design is everywhere, but poorly designed products cause more than mere discomfort. They can anger, sadden, exclude, and even kill the people who use them. From a bad interface that ended a young cancer patient's life, to product designs that exclude whole groups of people, Jonathan Shariat has seen his fair share of dangerous designs during his decades-long career as a senior designer. Fueled by his fervent belief in design's potential for positive transformation, Jonathan shares his insights on how to avoid its opposite through his latest book, Tragic Design: The Impact of Bad Product Design. Jonathan is an international speaker, podcast host, and senior interaction designer at Google. Before Google, Jonathan worked as a senior designer for Project Ronin, Intuit, and Hightail, as well as a product director for Therapydia. In this episode, Jonathan and I discuss the high stakes of bad design, the recurring patterns of design that anger, sadden, and kill customers, and how company values can impact the quality of design, products, and ultimately overall business success. We also talk about how to incorporate accessibility and human experience into design, especially the design of work, as well as other topics. Okay, if you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, my conversation with Jonathan Shariat. Jonathan Shariat, welcome to Work for Humans.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on your show.
I'm fascinated by your book, Tragic Design. And so this is an O'Reilly book. The subtitle is The Impact of Bad Design and How to Fix It. And you talk about a lot of really bad design on here. One of the things I like about this book that I admire about it is people may know that on O'Reilly books, there's always an animal. And I've always wondered how people get the animal that's on their book. But the animal on your book is a Portuguese man-o'-war, which is the perfect analogy for beautifully bad design.
Yeah, it's interesting because they give you the animal, and the one that I got originally was just, my pitch to them was, this is distractingly bad. Like, it's like a weird fish. Because I think they just kind of like go through it, and maybe they're running out of animals. But I pitched them on this one, and I feel like I kind of cheated the system because it's actually three organisms kind of, what's it called? Like they live
It's
dependent on
symbiosis.
each other. Symbiosis, that's the word. Thank you.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, interesting. But yeah, it's got the long entrails. And I felt like that was conceptually what this book represents. It's like there's so much under the water that's dangerous that we got to like look out for.
I have a sort of like a personal fear of Portuguese man-o'-war, which makes me, things that you're scared of, you tend to be fascinated by. And seeing this, because they're one of only a few jellyfish that will kill humans. There's some others, but they're really bad.
I swam near one of them one time, and the lifeguards were telling us that they can hurt you from 10 feet away because the tentacles just go so far out.
What is Tragic Design?
I guess I'll start with the story that kicked it all off for me, because it's so hard not to start there, because that's really what pushed me to want to write a book, and this book, and to open my eyes on the other possibilities that we explore in the book. So in short, I was working in design for a bit, and my wife was becoming a nurse, and her teacher was talking about technology in the hospital, how bad it was. And I was like, what? But, it can do so much good. And she shared this story about this young woman who came into the hospital for treatment of cancer. And the medicine that they give her is toxic, of course, and it requires hydration. Just for everything to even go well, just as a base, like they need hydration. But the software that these nurses were using, very seasoned nurses, was distractingly bad. They were charting, what's going on, this insurance, or making orders for medications, things like that. And in all of this distraction, they missed the fact that she needed post hydration. And so by the end of the next day, she was dead. If you listen to the news or you watch the news, there's a lot of bad things. But it's interesting because once in a while, one of those really sticks with you. You just can't get it out of your head and you want to do something about it. And this was one of those things. And I think the reason was, like, as people who work in technology, I don't know if you can identify with this, we're constantly thinking about the positive, like, how can technology make people's life better? And this was like one of the first times I was really thinking about, oh, wow, like, when can technology make people's lives worse? For me, worse was neutral. We're not making any effect. Our product was not effective. But here it was actually doing the opposite. And so I had this moment of passion about writing about this, put it on Medium, and it blew up. Like, other people felt the same way. And it wasn't just other designers and, of course, other like people in technology, but also people outside, people who had their own experience with the medical care system or some other related system where there was high stakes. And a lot of people really identify with that. It became like, number one on Medium for that day. And then like it stayed in the top 3 or 5 and for a week. It was really interesting. And right before then, O'Reilly had approached me about writing a book. So when I had written that article, I was like, hey guys, I think it should be about this because I can write about this.
You talk about different kinds of tragedy. So one kind of tragedy is the one you just named, which is that poorly designed products can kill people. But you go beyond that and you go into poorly designed products can anger people, can sadden people, and can exclude people. And so I want to go through each of these. And ultimately, this is a show about work. And so we're going to come back to the design of work and we're going to talk about how this relates to it. But we're going to use a lot of examples from product design because they're so much more concrete. And so the part about injuring people, some of it is that products are powerful and an inappropriately used powerful thing is dangerous. My sister's a nurse and she works or did work with neonatal children. And so it was so easy with such tiny patients to get the medications off by an order of magnitude. You're using the medications because it's a powerful medication, because it can do something good, but then it becomes very twitchy in terms of how dangerous it can be. So when you look at examples of products that hurt people, is it usually around that? That's sort of a powerful thing misused, like an airplane, for instance? Or are there other issues?
Absolutely. I mean, whenever there's impact, if we are working on something that can have impact, that same impact can go either way. So if you're thinking about, hey, we can save people time, let's say, just something very simple and low stakes like that, you have the ability to potentially to waste people's time, right? You have the ability to save a life. You have the ability to hurt and take away a life. And generally, there's always that. So when we work in technology and we work with any kind of product that can insert itself into life, it's the wholeness of life that it can affect, and it can be positive or negative. And I think that's what most people miss. And we talk about different ways to prevent that in the book, but oftentimes we're thinking about just the positive and we miss a whole space of risk that we can avoid and also opportunity that we can move forward to.
And we're going to get into specifics. One of the things I noticed as a pattern throughout a lot of these is that we fail with the edge cases. We design for the average, we design for the center, and it's hard to research the 1 in 1,000 case, right? It's hard to incorporate that.
Yeah, the black swan events. Yeah, I think hearing about, a lot of different kind of debates in this area, one thing that I've come to realize is that, sometimes there's these black swan events, you can't think about them. And I think if you do some of the things that we propose in the book, you might catch some of those things or prevent them and find, of course, there's always a balance between how much resource the team has to spend on preventing these things if they really are, and then they might happen and it's very unfortunate. And we talk about this in the book very directly with the Ford Pinto story. And it's not even like a product design thing. It was actually more of like an engineering business thing, but it was so poignant and is used in a lot of other educational areas to point this out. But the story is that the Ford Pinto famously, when rear-ended, would burst into flames. The reason was that the gas tank was on the bottom in order to increase the trunk space, which was very competitive at the time for those models. So they moved it down a bit. And then also with the jamming of from the back, the doors would also shut. So just a very big recipe for disaster. And during testing, they found this. First of all, they went to the engineers and said, this is a problem. So the engineers, with the time they had, came up with a solution that was something like, let's say, $13 per vehicle, which, adjusting for inflation, let's say it's like a few hundred or something. Then the business had to decide, okay, how many times do you think this will happen? What's the impact, and how much will we get sued? All that kind of stuff. They made a calculation and they said, ship it. I'm going to pause there before I talk about what else happened, because I think we've all made this decision, right? Like, okay, we know this is going to affect this many users. Is it really worth it to address? Accessibility is one of those things that happens that often. And we make the calculation like, listen, we can't just waste another 2 weeks on this for this small user base. Like, let's ship it and maybe we'll fix it later. And of course, it never happens. But there is a scale of that, because I think there is also times where that is very much true and accurate, right? Like the person who they referenced in this, his economical formula for this, he was asked this by a student in one of his lectures. And his response was, if it cost trillions of dollars to save a few people, would we do it? No, because that would harm other people. So there is like an answer to it out there. And I thought that was fair, but there is also this weird thing that happens when we just put it into a formula and we push it out, is some of those variables can change if we push ourselves. If we draw some lines in the sand, if we have some principles for the team. And in fact, once that became a bigger problem, they went back to the engineering team. In a very short amount of time, that engineering team came up with a cheaper solution that was able to mitigate the issue. So if, let's say, we rewinded time and they said, no, we cannot ship because we only want to ship safe cars and we don't want that to happen to anybody, and gave the team a little bit more time, maybe they wouldn't have hit their market goals, but they wouldn't have almost tanked the entire Ford company. And potentially the impact might not even been there that they thought with the competition. So what I find is when we restrict ourselves, given these ethical kind of guidelines and principles, the team has the opportunity to change those variables.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, you address it in the book, which is that there's sometimes a false assumption that the best design is more expensive, that the process of arriving at a really good design that is not harmful is more expensive. And what I see there is that you can't research every edge case. In the case of the Pinto, they knew, but in other cases, you can't research every edge case, but you can imagine edge cases. You can predict them to some extent. And at very low cost, integrate that into your design before ever reaching tooling. And that's the most inexpensive time to do it.
Yeah, we see this with accessibility. I find this time and time again. Everybody feels like accessibility is a high cost. But when we implement it properly, like we've done in Google One, the cost to the team is very minute and the impact is very high. You're able to open it up to more people. It literally so much so that there is a term that is based off of accessibility that is used widely called the cut curb effect, where essentially you make a change in one area and it benefits another area. But that comes from accessibility. In, I think, like the 70s, they add new legislation that you need to cut the curb and make it like slant for wheelchairs and other things to be able to use. But everyone benefited. Somebody moving a stroller or moving a bunch of boxes on one of those dollies, or just not falling off, not realizing that the end of the paveway was there, right? Like it really benefits in so many ways. Plus, of course, you're opening access to people who are blocked by it. And I think the one that I identified the most with in the book was the Facebook example. Facebook put together this really great product feature where they would look at the past year, find your most liked photo, and it was like one of the first year in reviews that came out. And they had the celebration. They picked the most liked photo and said like, hey, you've had a great year. And they had a bunch of like illustrations behind it and like partying. The problem is not everybody had a great year. And at the time, you could only like a photo. So your most liked photo could have been actually in support of something bad that happened. And there was a lot of examples that happened after they published this. We had somebody in the tech community who shared his story with us about his daughter passing away. And that was very painful for him to be reminded in such a bad way where, you have partying behind her picture and saying you've had a great year. It's I did not. People having their house burnt down or losing loved ones or pets, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason I identify with this one the most is I could see myself making this mistake if I'm being really honest with myself.
As a designer.
Yeah, as a designer and like part of the product team and saying, hey, what could we do? Like, yeah, let's celebrate their year. And just getting so focused on this one idea, not taking the whole of human experience and thinking, how can we serve people who've had a bad year? And making sure that it does that. And it's actually a better experience. Imagine if you had a really painful experience that year and Facebook could recognize and pull that and said, hey, and they just treat it with respect. Like if you've ever gone through that kind of painful experience and you've had somebody come in your life to just kind of be there for you, that is worth more than another time where somebody's just kind of celebrating with you, right? Like those friends really get a lot of friendship credit, if you will. And our products could do the same if we were thinking about those areas, right? Like if your grandpa passed away or something, and Facebook had a great way of memorializing them and offering the ability for people to come together and remember them, that would be really nice. And that would be a really great product value that you wouldn't really be thinking about if you were just thinking about the one idea that you were trying to execute on.
We're now in the category of products that sadden us. And when I think about work in general, there's no doubt that as a product, it can be deadly. And lots of jobs are deadly. And they're deadly from just straight up physical harm, but also through burnout, for instance, and the associated things related to stress. But I want to go into sadden for a little bit and talk about some of the subcomponents, the things that sadden us about a product. And so what I wrote down here was the thing you were talking about, which is bringing up tragic events and pushing them toward us when we don't want them. You have a section on allowing abuse, that some platforms don't restrict the harm that one person can do to another. And you have a section on don't underestimate the power of symbols. And remember that every user will die. I think that might have been two different points, but let's talk about the power of symbols first. What is an example of that?
Yeah, with the power of symbols, you can really interpret it the way you want to. And people do. People get really flexible. Emojis, of course, are a great example of that, where a single emoji can have like 10 different meanings given the context. And people use them in different ways to express themselves, just like there's 100 different smiles you could do. And one could be snarky smile. One of them could be like, I know what you meant smile. There's so many different ones. So that's just, humans express themselves in so many different ways. We talk about this in the book of just pausing in this product life cycle of trying to like come up with something to ship. Just taking a few minutes even can have a huge impact of just saying, what could go wrong here? Or like the sadness officer, right? Like the sheriff of saying like, okay, well, giving one person kind of permission to explore that space, because oftentimes we don't want to be the Debbie Downer to say like, well, what if the user dies? Or what if the user is divorced? Or what if the user is a stalker, But kind of taking a moment just to think about the opposites or the negative aspects. And people are smart. We can actually think of a good 80% of them just in like 10, 15 minutes, right? So even just doing that, that's often missing. And we can think of a lot of these things.
One thing about product design teams good ones, is that they are incredibly optimistic, right? They're super optimistic. They have to be to get over all the hurdles that they have to go through to actually ship a product. And so they have to be optimistic and just taking a moment to be pessimistic about what could happen.
It's so crazy how often that doesn't happen because you're right. We have to be optimistic to innovate, to think of like what could be out there and do some really good things. But what's interesting is, and it's a little counterintuitive, but being pessimistic can also be innovative. If you think about the age-old example of the airplane and the parachute, right? Like, the person who invented the parachute made a killing as well.
Oh, that's a really good point. Let's go on to anger and products that anger us. One of the things you say is that of all the ways we can hurt our users, emotional harm is the most common. And so, what are the things that anger us about design?
There's a lot of different, I mean, frustration, right? The wasting of our time and not valuing the user, by not having respect. Oh, we've all felt this. You feel personally offended. You feel angry and kind of, you're very put off. Like they did something to you, right? Violated, if you will. For example, the other day, I had subscribed to like a boxing watching service or something. There was a fight like a year ago that I really wanted to watch with some friends. And I found out that they had been charging me the entire time. I thought I had canceled. They made it very, very difficult to find out how to cancel, how to get a refund. I mean, just like you're searching through the FAQ, nothing. And the link sends you somewhere that doesn't, nothing. And they didn't send me an email that said, hey, we charged you this month. There was no emails, zero emails, right? I felt angry, like lividly angry that they wasted like a few $100s from me, right? And as a company, it's very easy to ignore that and not really feel the impact of that because you're looking at the data. I'm sure they're looking at the data and saying, wow, these changes we made have really improved our revenues a lot. People are staying longer, they're spending more money, but we all know where this story goes anecdotally, which is, these services end up going by the wayside, where these things work in the short term, but they really hurt you in the long term. I will never subscribe to that ever again. And I will tell everyone I know not to subscribe to that. And that effect takes longer to impact a business.
I notice with both good and bad design, one of my favorite companies for design is OXO. My understanding is that their great designs came from one of the owners had a relative who had arthritis. And so they needed to be able to hold kitchen implements with bigger handles and things like that. When I use one of those tools, I feel very seen. I feel like there's somebody out there who cares about me. They thought about me, even though they don't know me, when they were creating this particular product. And the same is true for a product like that angers you, which is this person was inconsiderate of me. They did not think about me. But what's interesting is that I'm looking past the product and I'm looking at the designer. At least I am. And so when you were angry, who were you angry with? Who did you personify? Who did you see over there?
I just thought like this, and also I guess in the back of my head, I know it's a group of people, sometimes over time, different people, like some people come in the company and they leave. It's tough that there's not like a person to talk to. And we talk about this in the book, that if this was like in real life and I went around pushing you, if I just like pushed you and I pushed a bunch of people, it's not that big of a deal to get pushed, right? But you'd be a little angry. But if I did that all day, every day to 10,000 people, I would be quickly known as a huge jerk and people would do something about it, right? Maybe even the police would come to my house. But it's interesting that when we do that, when we have these small annoyances at scale, we need to think about that as like a very big impact that we often just gloss over to say, yeah, these users will be a little bit annoyed, but it's okay. And you get this a lot of times from doing qualitative interviews. I remember at a previous company, we wanted to do something, but as soon as we had some qualitative, I got some qualitative interviews and got some actual snippets of people reacting to the thing, we were able to change the mind of leadership. It just became so much more clear and you have this connection with the people. And actually, the end result was much better. We came up with a much better pricing structure that was clearer and converted better. And that's that same thing where it's like if you put those guardrails in place and you force yourself to think of a better solution, it's often out there, just out of reach. It just takes a little bit of faith, if you will. And that faith piece is really interesting because it's oftentimes very difficult to measure some of these impact things like dark patterns, which we talk about a lot in the book, are tricks that, we trick the user into doing actions we want them to do, but they didn't intend to do. Like if trying to cancel a service and they make it really hard to find out where to do that and how to do that. That's a dark pattern. And the impacts of that are immediate, but the negative impacts on that are delayed. So someone will eventually find out how to cancel, or they will cancel through their credit card or whatever it is. So oftentimes we see this delayed reaction, or it's difficult to measure so that product team doesn't make good decisions around that. Even though we know it, we have case studies, we have our own real life examples, we just can't measure it as easily as we do these immediate conversions.
Yeah, it's funny. For some reason, the Rob Report decided that they wanted to start sending me a catalog, really big, fat catalog that is really about products that would be appropriate for some Soviet oligarch or something, super yachts and $50,000 watches and all these different things. So there's a couple things there. First of all, they were mistaken. I think they saw my zip code and they thought I was rich. But it harmed me because I wanted a $50,000 watch.
Yeah.
I have a problem. I can't help wanting a $50,000 watch, and I know I will never have one. It was just full of things that would make me unhappy with my non-oligarch life. So then I wanted to cancel it because they were basically shipping angst to my house every day. And at enormous environmental cost, because this thing looked like a phone book. There must be a lot of money in selling stuff to the ultra-rich. And could not cancel it. Super hard to find it. It's like the unsubscribe button at the bottom of emails. Could you fit it into one pixel? I don't know. They're trying. And what you talked about, which I thought was one of the great dark patterns, was roach motels. You can enter, but you can't get out. You just can't unsubscribe.
Easy to get into, hard to get out. Yeah. It's really interesting because when you read up on the different types, you start to see it everywhere. And I think that's true of a lot of these cases we talk about in the book. Once you've opened your eyes to like this world of design, you start to see it everywhere of how important it is, the way that we make things for others, and then the values that go into that. There, you see them everywhere. And the laws are catching up with dark patterns. California passed some laws, other states, federal, of course, the EU, there's a ton of laws, privacy laws, things that are all catching up. And they're starting to impact businesses, right? Like Facebook took a humongous hit when Apple decided to put more clarity into data collection and to give users the ability to say yes or no. So on iOS overnight, a bunch of people said no. And their stock took something like a 30% hit or something like that overnight. And so these things take a long time to catch up. I'm sure Facebook made a lot of money off of those people for a long time, but their business is in jeopardy and it's not as defensible. So these things, unfortunately, sometimes take time to catch up with people, but they are definitely there. And that's how the world works.
I'll tell you one of the dark patterns about work. Some dark patterns are on purpose. That's what makes them dark. And some of them are by accident. One of the accidental ones related to work, and I've seen it with teachers, which is the way the pensions work, they don't really start to pay out until after 25 years. And so people will get 15 years in and they are done teaching and they can't leave. They've lost the passion for teaching. And by the way, I'm not tarring all teachers that way at all. And it's not their fault that they feel that way, but some do. And it becomes very difficult to leave. And so it was actually Peter Drucker who pointed that out and said that trapping people into employment, even with something good, can be bad for their lives. And so all they'd have to do is change the rate at which the pension provides returns and make it linear instead of curved, and exponential. So I can see that. And I can also see it in another place. You talk about impolite technologies. And this is under anger. technologies that are selfish or lazy. But one of them you mentioned is gluttons. And what you were talking about there was that things that were essentially hogs of systems resources. So things that are going to load up your device with tons of memory eating stuff. But I see it in work all the time, which is that some work is gluttonous in terms of the demand on limited resources.
Yeah, and time being even one of those, right? Like, or visual attention, like if we're splashing things all over their screen all the time, it's like this product thinks it's very important, but it is not. And then a user will make that decision to say, I'm going to uninstall this app.
It's a little bit like the role of your telephone at work, which is how many times in the evening do you check your phone to see if somebody at work has texted you or, it is very much of a resource hog in terms of your attention at times.
It's interesting, like when you look at these different ways, things might pop into your head. Like maybe some listeners just now said, oh, yeah, what about this? I wonder if we could change this. And that's what I really love about this whole thing is it's not meant to be a blame game. This book is not meant to say, hey, look at all these people, they did really bad, don't do bad. It's really meant to say like, hey, look, if you just think about these things, you might think of some things that you need to change and of course, avoid some of those harms, make better decisions. And I think there's this really big solution space out there of doing the opposite. It's sort of like a brainstorming technique, even where it's like, okay, if you're stuck or you have writer's block or you're brainstorming, you're blocked, to say, okay, what are the things we shouldn't do? And you just start writing those down. Like, what are some bad ideas, right? That's essentially this. Like, these are all, I'm kind of documenting some bad ideas for you. And this should inspire you to think about some other aspects, whether it is directly related to that, to address that, or it's just the opposite of that thing. Like, in this case, it could be like finding ways to be like very resource unintensive. I don't know. The way I think about that is like, there's a good use case from World of Warcraft, one of the biggest games of all time, definitely the biggest online game ever. And they made $15 a month per user for millions and millions of users. So they made lots of money, right? And they did something very interesting. They thought about this space and they were able to be one of the first games that would allow you to download the most smallest installer ever and start playing while they started to continue to download things in the background. And that allowed them to get more users to start, more users to pay. These things can inspire you to think of new solutions that you may not have been thinking about when, every other game would be like, let's just give them as much resources as possible. They'll download it and then they can start.
Talking this way just made me think of one for email, which is that today you can schedule an email to launch on Monday instead of Saturday or Sunday. But you could easily, by default, make it that have to say, I want it to deliver right now on a Saturday or a Sunday. And the default is it's going to not deliver until Monday morning. You could switch that in a work environment and say, look, unless you say this is urgent, it's not going to go until Monday morning. Because, it's very easy to just start accepting things. To just say, oh, this is the way work is. It's going to follow me, through the most important parts of my life.
Yeah. It's a thread you get to pull at. And your competitors, like we all work in a competitive space, right? And your competitors are not thinking about that, right? It's this like also a huge opportunity to differentiate your product. I love the case study of T-Mobile. So T-Mobile years ago was a Dutch telecom trying to make it in the United States and was not going well. They were really struggling. They were almost about to pull out of the United States. They tried a different CEO. And this CEO, forget his name, he's the CEO now, I believe. But he was like, let's just take all the things that these people are doing, these telecoms are doing, and do the opposite. Like even like their pitch to users was that like we're the anti-carrier or something like that. It said, here's like unethical things, bad things that they're doing. Let's do the opposite. Okay, like they lock you into contracts. Let's do a more flexible, open contract. They required you to keep purchasing your phones. We'll do a trade-in program. I don't know if you remember this, if you've had a phone for a while, but the whole nickel and diming, if you go over your data cap, that was a big thing back then. If you're roaming, if you're going to a different state or country, they'll charge you. And they just undid all of that. And they went from being a nobody carrier to being the top carrier in the United States right now. I don't know if they're continuing to doing that or not, but like that one strategy shift to saying, let's take this ethical issue as a competitive advantage. And they were able to make billions of dollars doing that. And there's so many examples of that. And I think it's really interesting to explore that space because that just shows if you look at this tragic design thing, this is the tool set to avoid harm and to innovate.
Yeah. I've often said that any company that ships self-loathing has a competitive disadvantage. And so I think of Blockbuster when it used to have late fees and made so much money off of late fees. Data overages are another one, which is the company makes some money, but the cost to me in self-loathing for having left the video under the seat of my car for a month was so great that when Netflix came along and gave us a system where there was no self-loathing shipped, it was so much better. It was so much because I was so tired of hating myself for the late fees.
And there's actually a cognitive psychology driver of this, which I didn't know until after I wrote the book, called reactance. It's that building up of the fight or flight. It's like, if something scary happens in that moment, you have a big reaction, fight or flight. But reactance is like essentially the building up of that. And so like we see that, we've all have our own stories of that with some sort of product that we just rubbed us the wrong way for just a little bit too long, and then we were out. And I think that's really why sadness matters. That's why anger matters. Of course, physical harm. This does have an impact. And we've seen so many case studies, like you just said, they were probably making a killing. If they were looking at their books and say, hey, look, we just increased these late fees or we made these late fees harder to understand. We just made a ton of money. And then until boom, it didn't. Same thing with so many other companies.
Yeah, you mentioned something, which is that money is easy to see, but emotions are hard to see. How can companies, well, let's talk about it in a more concrete, not how can they, but how do they start to perceive, how do these emotions emerge? I mean, sometimes they emerge as a class action suit, which is the worst possible, right? How can you tell this is going on and remedy it?
I think the most popular way, which is not a great way, but it is a way, is the surveys that they do. Like, how likely are you to recommend Coca-Cola to your friends? It's like, I don't recommend drinks. It's like, but even if it's a bad question, it at least is a temperature check in the general direction. And so they're able to see hey, we asked this bad question over here, and it was at this number for a very long time, and then we did this thing, and it's been dropping. I have an example, I believe I wrote in the book, is, I worked at a company where we did this credit card form for a free trial that I was working on. And the dark pattern they wanted me to implement was, hey, if you sign up for this, it looks like it's very little per month. But actually, after the trial ended, we charged you for an entire year. So they shipped it. And of course, I pushed back before, but I didn't have enough, knowledge at the time or didn't know what to say to convince them. But I wasn't done with it. So I ended up talking to customer support. I talked to our social team and things like that, and started to pick up some knowledge, right? Because the data team originally was like, yeah, this is making a lot more money. It's like, well, yeah, of course, right? But then customer support calls went up. There's a cost to that. Cancellations went up. There's a cost to that because you get cancellation fees back from the credit cards. And then on social, people are there's a big uptick in people saying some bad things. So I put all that together and went back to the VP and said, hey, look, this is like a spike, but that initial spike is already starting to drop and all those negative things are happening. So I think those are some other aspects that we can use to understand things, such as social media is a great one. People post their emotions on that all the time. One of the things I do when I'm interviewing at a company or I was just starting at a company is I will take to their company name and search on social media however I can and just look for like hate or not like. And then you get tons of things that people will say like, oh, I really hate this thing that they do, or I hate this thing that they added, and you can kind of get some idea of what the people are feeling and how strongly from that as well. And then of course, qualitative interviews are such a lifeblood of a company. Talking to your users, like some of the best companies and the best CEOs, they put this at the center of their company, is like they put the user first, and they do it in a way that actually gives them a voice, not just like we put the user first, but they just do whatever they want to do. They actually are talking to users. Sometimes I worked at Intuit, and they had these things where people would just go to a small business owner and just watch them for an entire day. And I think those things, a lot of product decisions came from either a direct experience or just from understanding the person and having empathy with them. So I think those are some ways. The other ones are, of course, having backstop metrics for your tests. A lot of times this is glossed over, but if you're going to do a test or you're going to roll something out, have backstop metrics, meaning we are going to test the 30-day cancellation, impact to 30-day cancellation. We are going to test a reduction in engagement over here, and coming up with what those should be.
One of the people interviewed in the book said that all user research is about understanding context. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, because a lot of times what we think we're researching is a product. We think that the product's in the center, but this is saying, and it actually said that some of the context is your user. And so it's who are they? How diverse are they? What are their challenges? But also, what's the world in which this product is going to live? And I just thought that slight reframe of looking at the context instead of the foreground, which is the product, was a really powerful one.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice highlight, because that is also why the book is important. Is some people might say, well, I'm not going to kill somebody in my line of work. It's almost impossible, right? And so I don't understand like how I'm supposed to apply this part of the book or something. But what these things do is they start to put things into perspective and context that allows you to work on things in a better way. Right? You have more dots to connect. That's why also in the book, we try to give the big examples that get your attention, but also the little everyday ones. Like, for example, with physical harm, ergonomics is something that comes up a lot. People don't think about, but if you're putting a button that a user needs to tap in your app, 50 times a day at the top of the screen, that's going to start to really hurt people's fingers, right? Or, maybe it's really hard to see and you're straining people's eyes. I get headaches sometimes at the end of the day, right? If I'm on the computer too long. So these are things that, you might not be thinking about because you don't have those dots, but maybe with them, suddenly what you're working on in the foreground starts to connect with a bunch of other things. And that's really my hope with it.
I'm very interested in the idea of doing last straw interviews. So first of all, I have done in-context qualitative research of how, for instance, managers experience work. And some of that was very powerful, which was shadowing. And I've always wanted to shadow a manager and an employee into a performance conversation. But it's very hard to get in there. People don't actually want you to be there.
Yeah. And also like the observation, I don't know what they call it, but like by observing it, you change the outcome.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah, no, that's right. It's very true. But you would find things that, this was a really interesting one, which was that we were looking at managers in Singapore. This was not for the company I work for now, but another company. And the managers were all European, and the workforce was all not European. And it changed the dynamic of how management was working there. And there's no numeric measure that you could have used to perceive that tension, which was essentially the way that the anthropologists on the team described it was a colonized relationship. So there's just nothing like qualitative research. And the way I argue for qualitative research is usually, look, numbers are going to give you averages. Qualitative research should be about understanding the extremes, finding how much variation there is. If you find one person, because qualitative research is so time-consuming that you can't do 10,000 people in qualitative research. But if you find one person who's out on that fringe in the 100 people you talk to, there's probably 1,000 of them or 10,000. So I really agree about qualitative research.
Yeah, it's also the unknown unknowns. Like, you can only measure what you're looking for. Sometimes, people get lucky and they're really good with analytics and they can see something in the data. But, 99% of the time, you're looking for something and you want an answer. So it's a known unknown, and then you measure it and then it's known. But with qualitative, yeah, you find out all these unknown unknowns, things you were never looking for, never thinking about. And oftentimes it can even help you know what to go and measure or what to even go survey in the first place. Or like, if you're shadowing, it's like, oh, I never realized that 6 different people use the same login. Like they just leave the computer open and they're all doing different things. Okay, or things like that. There's just these unknown things because we are not each other and we use things in totally different ways and we have totally different lives. Even though we're all human and we share so much in common, there's also so much difference between us, which is great. But it also means that we can't just design and create things on our own. We really have to just go and be in it as much as possible. Like I worked at a company that did like a cancer care stuff. And there was this whole line of thinking we had around how someone would set up their phone and even thinking about how we thought we were so smart about how a loved one could help them set up their phone. But what we realized is after using it is that actually nobody's in the mood. It is not the mood to talk about this app in this moment at all, being in that, right? So what's the right time? Oh, it's over here. This is a much better time when they're doing like the handoff and stuff, right? So it's just like never ever gonna come up in data because you don't know how to look for it. You don't know what to measure. You don't know. But when you're in it, it's just immediately obvious.
You talk about the sad sheriff, which every time I read it, I think the sheriff is sad. But sad is they're the sheriff of sadness.
Sheriff
is what
of
they
sat
are.
down, yeah.
But there's also maybe a sheriff of badness, which is it's hard to know how people might misuse a product. I think it was very hard to predict that Apple's AirTags would be used to stalk people, that people would put these locator tags in people's car or something like that. I think it's hard to predict. I, as somebody who works on management philosophies, see that some management philosophies, when you roll them out as a solution, are misused. Recently, we had Kim Scott on the show, who wrote Radical Candor. Her thing was, no, I didn't mean that you can just be rude. That's not what I was talking about. It's not licensed to be a jerk. It's compassionate. We had Fred Reichheld on the show, who invented the Net Promoter Score and was the champion of customer loyalty. Well, the Net Promoter Score is widely abused, and he hates that. He's really trying to fix that. And so, is there a review that can be done around how people with bad intent might misuse something?
Yeah, I think, in that same kind of moment where you have like a sadness shift, I mean, you can either make them separate depending on your project and how much focus needs to be done on these. But having a brainstorm with the team on how could this be abused? How could this be misused is really helpful. An example of that was like, also with Drive, they were like allow the ability to share, and suddenly people were getting spammed with Drive file shares where they actually just had a link because they could just easily email anybody who would come from Google and all that, right? So then they had to tackle that issue. We had the same thing when I first started out on like, we had a file sharing thing, it's like, this is all been, and then that was like, 13 years ago. So we've had this problem for a long time, I'm sure social media, like all the time, right? You're getting spammed with links and stuff. So trying to understand how people can misuse something will avoid some harm. And it's starting to be done a lot more now, risk mitigation and things like that. Like I think in this aspect, there's actually a lot more tools out there. If you look up risk mitigation and engineering, and right, there's a lot of stuff out there. Or if it's like in work, like thinking about how people could misuse it is really helpful. And there are also systems in place, in academia, when you're doing a research paper, they make you, really focus in on that as an area. So it's really just taking the time. Like we are all very smart, but we're also very distracted. So if you just carve out that time in your process of whatever you're working on, you'll think of a good chunk of the stuff. And, if you do some sort of qualitative research or you talk to friends or whatever it is, the more people you talk to, the percent of things you might miss will definitely keep going down. But, it's always like Occam's razor. You're never going to get there.
Let's talk about the user interface of work. What's your assessment? And the user interface, let's talk about what the user interface even is. To some extent, it's your computer. To some extent, it's your management. To some extent, it's your team. To some extent, it's the help desk. How's that user interface?
I think it's interesting. For me, one of the things that came to mind when you said that was I recently, I've been remote and then I've also been coming in. And every time I come in and like I only have my laptop, I just feel totally constrained. The amount of surface area I get here at home is great. I can have so many different things open and my mind can kind of dart between them. And then it also makes me think about this push towards VR headsets and AR headsets that would infinitely expand that canvas. And then I think, actually, I got this really big monitor, but I think it's a little too big. I think there is sort of like, it needs to expand enough to like give me I also need focus. I can't just walk into a room and look around for my file. I can't just have 60 screens open. Maybe some people need that and things coming and going. One of the interesting things I find it's like having it flat and having it sort of contained is very useful. Maybe there's a future of work where somebody could be way more productive and I just haven't experienced it yet. But I think that's an interesting aspect is like, is there a point where it's too much for our brains? We can't get more productive? And AI is the other one where people are using AI as an extension of themselves. Like I would think it's more of a tool versus like the interface, but it almost is the interface as well. Like where you're doing this dance with, let's just call it a robot, where you're working together and it becomes like an interface where you're having to think about prompts and you're having to think about how you can leverage the new calculator, in different ways. One last thing is like people still use a lot of paper materials. It's like whatever works, right? And just having the flexibility is more important than constraining people to one way of working.
Do you perceive that any of the design of work is tragic?
I mean, I haven't given it a lot of thought. Obviously, ergonomics is one way that could be tragic, where, if we are in VR headsets all day, that could physically harm us. And then there's also impacts to that. Like if you're in one world, you're not in the other. I think some of the products are starting to think about that. We've had some products in the past that have already done a lot of this stuff, but they were rejected by society because people were walking around with cameras on their faces and stuff. People did not like that. So thinking about those tragic examples helps you to think about like, well, how is this going to be accepted by society? How is this going to be used? Are people taking pictures where they shouldn't be taking? Are people not available to their friends and family when they're in this? Like some of these VR headsets have this opaque mode where you can just like see what's in front of you, or you can get some sort of notion about what else is happening in the room while you're also in this other reality. So I think that's going to be really important. And yeah, I mean, I think with just like the overall like setup of how you work, flexibility is always key. This is another great story in the book I think we should cover. It's somewhat related, but the US Air Force, they were studying pilots in World War II, and they took all the average measurements and they put together an average cockpit and they went out and tested it, and a bunch of pilots had to bail and some died, right? They said, well, what's going on? Why is this like not working so well? And then one of the people working there went and said, okay, let's find how many people are average. How many people fit these measurements? Zero people fit those measurements, right? And what they found was that they needed to create a few different abilities in the cockpit seat of, putting the seat farther back or forward, up or down, some of those things. And when they did that, the problem went away overnight. The pilots could easily just kind of change the seat around and do different things. Different pilots could use the same cockpit. Like it was just like this net benefit, right? I think it's the same thing for work. And it's whether it's work from home or work from the office, it's what kind of, should you be using a Mac or a PC? Or should you be using this or that? It should just flex to the different needs of different people because we are different and we need to kind of enhance what is good in our brains and help out the crutches that we need and get those all together until we're operating efficiently.
What's so interesting about that is that you can't perceive somebody's context very easily. The context that they're in, the context that they will be using this work experience in. You just had somebody bring you lunch. That's a part of your context. And it's something that might not happen if you were in the office. So This is a question I ask every person who comes on the show, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
Yeah, I mean, a job is a contract where right, it's a both ways. So I contribute. So for me, a job, what it does for me is, other than of course providing, because there's a certain point where that becomes less and less valuable. It's still valuable. Money is still valuable, but it becomes less valuable once my needs are met and I'm on track to, provide for my family. For me, it's really the ability to disconnect and be able to be with my family and spend that money, right? Like if I'm at work and I'm working all the time to get money, but I don't have the opportunity to enjoy it, it's worth $0. The other aspect is like, I enjoy my job a lot. Like I did a podcast about design. I wrote a book about design. I work and I really enjoy this process of understanding somebody's needs and just thinking about how we could continuously get better and better at addressing those. Like I'll never find that not interesting. And I've worked on a lot of different things that are people might find boring or like sales tax or exciting, like, saving people's lives and cancer care. But all of them I find interesting because I think what a job does for me is of course, it's still work, but you have to enjoy it so that you have fuel to drive ahead in that work.
I get that. I get that a lot. And in terms of the parts of work that reward you most, there's the research part where you're out there doing the qualitative research. And then there's the response to that research. Which of those two do you like best?
Oh, I always love the beginning. Like, I love having lots of problems. I love when the project seems like it's never going to happen, or you have no idea. You're trying to understand what the real problem is. I love that whole aspect of the beginning of trying to define the problem and come up with a path to the solution. I think that's my favorite slice because when I was early on in my career, it was always scary. It's like, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to happen. But after you've been doing it for a while, and like each time in the beginning, it feels like this is not going to go well, or I don't know where this is going to go. I don't know how we're going to get to something exciting or good. But it just happens so consistently that you have to have faith, in the beginning of that process to know we will get there. It becomes exciting. And it's like, you get to see magic every time, little miracles every time.
What I particularly love about the observation part of design research is that it's ground truth. I just love to see truth. And then I love to see patterns of truth emerge.
Ooh, yeah, ditto. One of my favorite things in the world is a really good A/B test, or like, or like you see these like scientific research papers come out that are confirmed by, 8 or 10. Like, I just love that like exact thing you said, where it's like, you learn something and it's something that is a new tool in your toolbox. It's like, hey, look, if we're able to remind people, like so many more people are going to do this. This is great. What else can we remind them about, kind of a thing?
You inspired me in this conversation to add something to the questions I ask. I may not ask this one on the show on a routine basis, but I really like the idea of asking people a last straw question about work, which is, when you left a job, the last time you left a job, was there a last straw? And what was it? Because the truth is, if you ask somebody why they left their job, they might tell you the last straw, but what you really want to get to is, and what were the things that preceded the last straw that put you into a place where this straw was the end?
Yeah, actually, I feel really comfortable answering this because I told them this already. I told the CEO this. Like, it was a smaller company, and I'll first start with just, I think that one of the amazing things this company did really well, and why I just thoroughly enjoyed my time there, is that there was a lot of openness and a safe space to share things and help each other out, or just even just share your honest opinion. But for me, the last straw was, you empower your employees to understand what's going on and make the right decisions. Then you also need to trust them that those are the right decisions to next. Like, we said, hey, we did all this research to understand this space, and we're understanding that we're not going to be able to make a product viable unless we pursue this other area. At this one, it needs to be a long-term investment. And we weren't able to get that leadership on board with that, given so much, what we felt evidence. So I think that was very difficult. But, it's interesting to see kind of where they're headed now as they're starting to, I've been tracking them. They're starting to kind of come around to that. But it takes faith. It's hard. I understand, like, when you're in leadership and you have people out there and where you think it needs to go, you also need to trust that that's your data and, coming in. Maybe not exactly that, but there's definitely something that they're saying that is going to be useful to make change with.
And if you're not being heard, then you're wasting your life.
Yeah, and 4 of the top people, 3 other people and myself, all left around the exact same time without talking to each other because, it's like, hey, we see the data in front of us. We thoroughly gathered the data and hashed it out. And we can't continue if we've come to a logical conclusion about the strategy, right? It's like we can't just blindly move ahead with that.
That's great. I think I am going to start asking that question because what's interesting about it is that the straws that led up to the last straw were good straws.
Yeah. Yeah, they were.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
I used to do a podcast, called Design Review. We don't do it anymore. We actually stopped at the beginning of this year because we said a lot there. But if you want to kind of see everything that's going on, it'll always be my website, which is, jonathanshariat.com. An easier one is just uitogether.com.
uitogether.com. Thank you very much for coming on the show. It was really fascinating reading your book. It was fascinating talking to you. Just to say, the word tragic design and the word dark patterns. I think putting the word dark patterns into every designer's vocabulary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is such a power, and both of these words, but just being able to have a word where we can say, oh, you're asking me to do dark design.
Absolutely. And having also even the sub-names too, there's power behind that to say, you're doing a Roach Motel, and they can look it up.
Yeah, right.
And they can say, like, I am doing a Roach Motel. People will change their behavior when it's like society has put a label on it versus if they feel like, oh, this is just something, you're just trying to put some friction in here because you don't want to do it or you feel this ethically this way or that way. But it's like, hey, as an industry, we've already labeled this. So I 100% agree that labels are powerful for good and bad.
And also, in the case of the Roach Motel, you had, here's the Roach Motel, here's how it works, here's how somebody got fined $130 million for it.
Yeah.
So now we've got this term and it has some authority behind it. I think that's really great. And we didn't even get into the whole part about accessibility, which I think is a really great part of the book that people should get the book for also.
Thanks. Yeah. It's been a really interesting practicing it here at Google. And I've really been impressed with everybody getting on board with it because once we had it all in place, because in other companies, I had asking, like, we got to be more accessible. We got to do this. But, I was begging, and I always felt like if we just do it, it's not going to be that much. It was always a hypothesis in my head. I've never been at a place that we fully got to implement an accessible pipeline in our product pipeline. And here at Google, we do. And sure enough, it does not take a lot of effort at all. As a designer, it takes me an extra maybe 10 minutes to spec everything out for accessibility, sometimes less. And then on the engineering side, we have automated tests that we built, and it was a one-time cost. We have, specifications that we like to aim for. And it's just the ongoing cost is really just a little bit of extra QA.
And think about the cost that used to be there in trying to convince other people to do it at other companies. At Google, it's mandatory that you go through an accessibility review.
Yeah. And it helps because once you're forced to do it right, you realize that this isn't actually so bad. This is not as hard or as time consuming as we thought. And so that is one of the things I just want to keep shouting from the rooftops. With accessibility, with tragic design, is these things we're not asking you to spend another week or two on the project. This is a single meeting. This is, 10, 15 minutes of thinking. And of course, if the risk of the product is high, you might want to spend more time. But in every project, just 10, 15 minutes.
Right. The higher the volume of the product, the more that are going to be produced, the less the per unit cost of that effort.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It was fascinating.
This was such a pleasure. I really appreciated the thoughtful questions, the deep follow-ups. I find it really engaging and fun. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.